Hello, everyone. This presentation is focused on structured planning. The people who benefit directly would be the VP of Strategic Alliances and Alliance Directors, Managers, and Sales Reps. Let's talk about the agenda today. We'll talk about the Power Influence Plan. And some of the plans that we will absolutely discuss is how to create leverage. We will not touch upon the relationship plan, but our whole idea is to balance the science and arts piece of structuring alliances. The impact is, of course, building a new approach, get the wheels moving of these strategic alliances. And the last part is, what does strategic alliances stand for? What's the real value? We talked about this piece, which is strategic alliance professionals have a lot of boundaries. And I personally believe that some of these boundaries will always remain. However, I think most of the boundaries kind of dissolve the moment we discuss one thing, and that is strategic alliances is all about power. Let's quickly go through this slide. World wars, or religion, organized religion, of course, financial companies, Star Wars, marriage between royals and elites, educators, businesses. The common theme about all this is only one thread, it's power. Just to give an example, world wars, for example, World War One or even two, it was basically one ecosystem against the other. So strategic alliances, again, as I say, is all about power. If we cannot explain the details of how the CEO can create power in the market, strategic alliances as a profession will never expand. So let's quickly go through this piece, which is for the CEO, it's all about how do you create power in the market, the competitiveness in the market, and with strategic alliances, can you create repeatable power in a deal cycle? Why is a deal cycle important? Simply because it's a zero sum game. You can either win or you lose. The only way to expand and grab market share is one and only one, which is win more than you lose and make it repeatable. So, I personally believe that the message to the CEOs in the past, which is, hey, this is a partners are better together, here's the value, here's the synergy, here's the technology fit, I think those days are gone. And to be honest with you, if you don't partner, somebody else will do it. So, partnership is not a choice, it is a must. Okay. So, I personally believe that this model that we are talking about, or we just talked about, better together thing, does not really align with the CEO. What aligns, again, is exactly what the CEO is thinking about: market share competitiveness, create, build, and sustain more power, and repeat, repeat, and repeat. Only strategic alliances can do that. So this aligns. Now, going back to a very important topic. In my opinion, alignment is what creates power. It is not engagement. Engagement is the force, but it is the alignment that creates power. So let's talk about it. The biggest challenge of alignment is the lack of clarity. And I think strategic alliances professionals should focus on clarity, clarity, and clarity. The moment you bring clarity to everything, alignment becomes way easier. Let me prove my point. Think of this. Let's say I give you a geometric drawing of a 3D figure. Now, this is the top view. Would you be able to explain what the 3D actual figure would look like? No. How about this? I give you a top view and a side view. So it's still not clear, right? You're not being able to connect the dots. Similarly, what if I give you a little more detail? You got a top view, you got a side view, you got a front view. And now it becomes much more clear. But the moment you can get all the views, the whole picture becomes easy. That's the power of clarity. And we're going to talk about one very key piece and element. I think a job of a VP of strategic alliances is to bring clarity and predictability in the entire business. The more clear everybody is, the more predictable it is. That's the reason the Ubers and the Lyft are doing so well, because they can give you time predictability, they can give you cost predictability. And that predictability is extremely important. That's what the human mind wants. So, as I say, if we can bring clarity and predictability, you'll be able to totally get the alignment piece and make things easy. That's what builds power. So, I just want to say this piece is important. Let's talk about a couple of structured plans that strategic alliance professionals must have. Some of these are extremely detailed, and I think one should have it. But we will just quickly end with a couple of very key elements that strategic alliance professionals need to have as a plan. And some of these plans are not even taught in any of the training programs. So the first thing is, you have to understand, is it an enterprise or a point play plan? Typically what happens is a point play plan means like a CAD software. You can just sell it. It has a finite use, and a certain org structure in the whole company buys it. When it comes to enterprise, it means the impact of the entire initiative is enterprise. IoT is exactly something like that. So IoT is more of a transformation. So there's a cause and there's an effect. The effect is enterprise. One needs to absolutely know which game they are in. There are other couple of plans, and I think this is something that people need to understand once they go through all the GSI videos on this website. There is a separate link to it. But just remember, the deployment and the integration plan of your software with the GSIs is extremely critical. So choosing the global system integrator is important, but who do you work with inside the global system integrator is the key element. For example, a Deloitte is not just a Deloitte. A Deloitte is broken up into or comprised of like 1,000 teams or 1,000 practices. Which team are you going to be working with? So let's say if you're working with Deloitte's SAP practice, you should say Deloitte SAP practice. Just saying I work with Deloitte does not make sense. It will not work. Similarly, the integrated services plan is extremely important, which means what are the typical services in the entire cycle of implementation, support, maintenance, etc., etc. And you can only get that if you understand the GSI org structure and the practices plan. There are other critical elements that just build on top of each other, which is the reason I'm showing you one after the other. So, for example, the deal making persona and process plan. How are deals made on the field? And if you're making the deal, who are the personas involved? This is fundamentally important when you're working with multiple teams and ecosystems, and the whole thing changes in a point place solution to an enterprise solution. Now let's build on top of this itself, which is, if you have an ecosystem, what is a deal making plan? Just remember that ultimately it's going to be one ecosystem against the other. It's going to be all about power plays. In an ecosystem, one has to be very careful, because when you take an ecosystem and win a deal, just remember that out of all parties in that ecosystem, there'll always be a loser. Change will always have a loser, because ultimately the ecosystem will drive the business, but when the business comes in, the customer always makes a choice. So there are other plans, and I strongly believe that one should go through all these detailed plans, but it's difficult to cover. So I'm going to cover a couple of very critical elements. You should have a minimum ground zero plan, which is you got to check your ecosystem. Most professionals do not choose the right ecosystem. And I think the best way to build an ecosystem is through an example. So let's say you've got a total project and there are multiple customers. You have your product, you have your favorite system integrator, but honestly, it's typically multiple products getting in the entire project. And system integrators do a marvelous job by creating the value by stitching all these pieces together. Now, one has to be very careful that different product companies can combine with system integrators and then build ecosystems and even remove you. So the competitive element should always be considered. So that's going to be very critical. Point number two is, and this is where the most important piece lies, when you build an ecosystem, there are three things that you always have to constantly think about. The first thing is who gains from your typical, you know, project cycle. So you need to identify in the total ecosystem of platforms, products, system integrators, and you got to stack them one by one because you know, uh, your application software will be on top of, say, an operating system like a SUSE, for example, or say a Red Hat or a Microsoft. Below that, you're going to find, say, hardware or virtual machines, etc. You have to understand that many of these product companies, they work like stacks and platforms, and you need to know who gains from you in this typical project cycle. Typically, you need to go two levels above you and two levels below you, and that's fundamental. The second point is who is dependent on you in a typical cycle. For example, if there is IoT, SAP, your ERP, will gain from the data that's coming from the factory, which is Industry 4.0. So, therefore, although it does not directly affect the SAP business, but the process changes in the factory ultimately creates a big need of services to expand SAP. So, very naturally, you know, it's a cause and effect. So you've got to understand who's dependent on you as well, but may not gain from you directly. The third piece is you absolutely have to understand who gets hurt from you in a typical cycle. Now, when you build ecosystems, do not just think about platforms and products. Remember, they are always going to require a service ecosystem. And the service ecosystem can be way more powerful than the product ecosystem. Always understand who gets hurt in a typical cycle because they are going to always be the main reason the ecosystem is going to get split into one ecosystem platform against the other. Now, we talked about enterprise or point plans, but I think uh, the fundamental thing that most people need to understand, what is the difference between them? Yes, of course. A point play plan is always less cumbersome, less complex. Of course, complexity is a key point in any play. But what makes a point play is that the end user, the producer, the decision maker, the budgeter, and the somebody who assumes the entire risk of the project, they are typically, in one organization or one department. Like, if you have to sell CAD, it has a certain specific department, like design. So it is a very point solution and a point play, for example. On the other hand, enterprise play is something very interesting. Let's go back to understanding this in detail. End user, producer, decision maker, budgeter, and the person who assumes the risk, they're all in different divisions and departments. The moment you understand all of them are different, all of them are in different divisions or departments or business functions, you realize this is an enterprise play. Most people make the fundamental mistake by following a sales cycle that works in a point play instead of an enterprise play. Okay, let's go to the next one. We have always talked about system integrators. My suggestion is go to the link, which has about 4 videos. I think there are 4 videos. It's going to give you an in-depth idea of how GSIs work. When GSIs work, they work in teams. And the important piece is you have to have a very structured approach. Who sells, who builds, who supports, who delivers the entire business, and which practice. My suggestion is you'll meet a lot of people who come from different practices and they have different agendas, different targets. For which I say, go ahead and study up the 4 videos. It's impossible to cover really every plan, and which is one of the reasons that we are happy to help you out. All these videos are free. And again, as I say, strategic alliances, the new value is power. Alignment and clarity is what builds power. Thanks, everybody.